Chapter 15. Pride and Superiority. Pride had limped ever since that eventful day when he tried to overpower Much Afraid on her way to the high places, and the shepherd had come to her defense and had hurled him over the cliffs into the sea. Yes, he still limped, and his handsome face was very much scarred. And this was a very sore blow to him, for he had always been one of the handsomest and strongest men in the valley. Doubtless it was the fact that he could no longer arrogantly flirt with all the pretty girls which had at last decided him to marry and settle down. He chose for his wife a relative of his, a wealthy young woman called Superiority, who had been waiting hopefully for several years for this event. She was by no means a beauty, but she was an heiress, and Pride had extravagant tastes far beyond the allowance which his father gave him. His wife brought him a fortune derived from investments in a company which had vast mining operations somewhere in the valley of the shadow of death. The mines were said to produce fabulous wealth, and the parents of Pride, Sir Arrogant, and Lady Haughty both drew their income from the same source. Strange as it may seem, the one special friend of Superiority's girlhood had been Much Afraid, the crippled, miserable orphan brought up in the home of Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Much Afraid and her three cousins, Gloomy, Spiteful, and Craven Fear, had all been Superiority's companions at school. She had disliked the three Forebodings very much indeed, being jealous of Gloomy's striking good looks and of Spiteful's cleverness, and she had detested the bullying Craven. Perhaps it was the fact that they all three gave her a strong feeling of inferiority, whereas championing the trembling, ill used Much Afraid gave her the soothing and comfortable sense of superiority her nature required, which was the real basis for this strange friendship. Much Afraid was not only ugly and crippled, but she was also stupid at her lessons, and Superiority had no need to fear for being surpassed by her in any way. The other girls and boys in general disliked Superiority, for she had far more pocket money than anyone else, and prettier clothes, and was known to be an heiress. Therefore, Much Afraid's grateful and adoring homage had been balm and incense to her self esteem, and had kept her from feeling friendless. Even when their school days ended and Much Afraid entered the service of the shepherd, friendship had not really been broken. By that time, Superiority was already smarting inwardly from the constant neglect of Pride and his slowness in proposing to her, despite the fact that his parents had chosen to consider the two engaged since their school days. During his many flirtations with other girls, it had soothed her wounded feelings to continue to stand up for Much Afraid and to insist that it was her horrible relatives who had driven her into the shepherd's service, and that no one could blame her for wanting to escape from such a home as hers as soon as possible. Then, when she went off with the shepherd to the high places, the dallying Pride, still without making any proposal to Superiority, had gone off in order to try to force Much Afraid to return, and had himself returned, not only having failed to achieve his purpose, but now so crippled and scarred of face that he was at long last ready to do what she had long awaited, to marry her. Superiority told herself, therefore, that her friendship and gracious championship of Much Afraid had been properly rewarded. Of course, as the wife of Pride, she was not tactless enough to speak of her old friendship with the one through whom Pride had experienced such a fall, and there had been no need to do so much and there had been no need to do so during Much Afraid's absence from the valley. It had been more difficult, however, when she actually returned with a new name, no longer crippled and disfigured, and attended by two regal looking handmaidens. Undoubtedly, this would have been enough to break the friendship at last, were it not for the fact that Grace and Glory herself had taken such loving pains to maintain it. She had immediately sought out her friend, had given herself no airs, and had been so affectionately interested in all her friend's concerns that Superiority had been quite disarmed. After all, she said to herself, she may be considerably better off than she was before, poor little soul. But my own position is unassailable. I have a husband, lovely children, a beautiful home, and an ample fortune, and my husband is heir to a title. Why should I grudge my friend an improvement in her own fortune? I shall certainly not parade the friendship before my husband, and Grace and Glory shows that she is tactful enough not to do so either. It is just as well, however, to keep in with the shepherd's friends and not to make enemies unnecessarily, as poor Pride had already found to his cost. But Superiority had begun to find that to continue a friendship with Grace and Glory was not the simple and easy matter which she had at first supposed strange as it seemed, considering the great difference in their worldly positions. It was impossible not to feel a growing sense of inferiority and envy. Certainly, Grace and Glory had no home of her own in the valley, no husband, no children, and no position. But in spite of that, she did really seem to live like a queen, waited on hand and foot apparently by her two regal attendants, every possible want somehow or other supplied, and enjoying complete liberty and independence. More extraordinary still was the growing influence which she seemed to exert on others. There were her aunt and cousins, for instance, so mysteriously changed in their attitude toward her, as loving now as they had been hateful before. In addition, so many of her fearing relatives were now actually entering the service of the shepherd. The influence and power of bitter pill for Superiority to swallow, for it was the shepherd who had humbled her husband, and now he who had been so long despised and ignored by the whole fearing clan was accepted by them all as a kind of king. It was not only the family of Mrs. Dismal forebodings. They were not rich and important people, even though they were related to Lord Fearing. There was bitterness, for instance, actually giving up his prosperous hotel in order to follow the shepherd, and now resentment had announced his intention of resigning as bank manager because the shepherd had infected him with scruples about the investments and the Dead Valley mines by which so many of the bank clients were getting rich. There was self-pity too, and his stupid little wife, helpless, actually working for the shepherd and apparently enjoying it. Furthermore, according to the valley gossip, a host of less prominent citizens were doing the same thing. Then, to top it all, Grace and Glory held a position of influence and authority among them, which she herself, the wife of Pride and daughter in law of Sir Arrogant, had never possessed. Came a day when Superiority asked herself if it would not be better to end the friendship and to escape once for all from the growing sense of inferiority which every meeting with Grace and Glory and with her friends increased in her. Should she give up her friend and so sever all connection with the cut herself off from all news of his doings, or should she and accept the fact that the one she had once patronized and championed had now surpassed her altogether? Strangely enough, superiority actually decided on the latter course. She could hardly tell why, except that when it came to the point, she found she really loved Grace and Glory as she had certainly never loved Much Afraid, and that she could not part with her friendship. As soon as she admitted that to herself, she realized also that deep down in her heart, she not only envied Grace and Glory, but also yearned passionately to find what Grace and Glory had found and to know the shepherd himself. She could not bring herself to confess this to anyone, but she made a secret inner choice. She would not give up the friendship with the one who now caused her to feel inferior and of whom she was envious. It was shortly after this decision that Superiority noticed a change in her husband. She was increasingly moody and silent and appeared to be weighed down by some burden, whether of anxiety or annoyance. She could not tell. He did not confide in her, tried to laugh off her anxious inquiries, and grew all the time more and more moody. One morning they entered the dining room for breakfast at an earlier hour than usual, for Pride had announced the evening before that he must visit the city of destruction and make an early start in the morning. His cousin Resentment, the retiring bank manager, had visited him that evening, and the two had been closeted together for some time. Superiority feared that the visit must be connected with some business trouble, for Pride had seemed so morose morose afterwards. She knew her husband's extravagant habits and wondered whether he had a big left at the bank, but she knew that her own fortune was ample for all their needs, and that while it was still in her hands, she could curb his extravagance, so she felt no fear. The memory of her husband's dark mood the night before, however, was swept out of her mind by the news she had to tell him, news brought by the milkman on his early round. Pride, said she excitedly as soon as he entered the room for breakfast. Do you know what happened last night? The milkman brought the news this morning. Mrs. Murmuring's hotel was burned to the ground. I understand nothing was saved at all. It seems that the new man Sharp, whom she made her manager when bitterness gave up his share in the business in order to follow the shepherd, it seems this man must have been drinking in his own room on the ground floor and somehow started the fire in that room. By the time the people upstairs were wakened, the whole ground floor was in flames and they had to escape from the windows. And when the fire engines arrived, the fire was completely out of control and the whole premises ablaze. They were fortunate to escape with their lives. Everything else is gone. Everything. They say that Murmuring herself was badly burned about the face and arms while trying to rescue the children, and several other people were injured too. What a loss it will be. I sure hope the premises were insured. Her husband, who had been staring at her with a strange, stricken look on her face, now muttered, I happen to know the place is not insured. That means Murmuring has lost everything. That man Sharp had persuaded her to use all her savings to enlarge and repair the place and to make those big alterations. The business was prospering so well that Murmuring decided this was the time to do it, and she told me that she would not insure it until all the expensive improvements were finished. What's happened to the man Sharp? Nobody knows. He has completely disappeared. Whether he was burned and lies under the ruins, or whether he escaped can't yet be known for sure, but it they think it likely he escaped, for the safe in his room was open and of course empty. Murmuring used to let him deposit the money there each evening, and she banked it the following day. It really is extraordinary the way she trusted that man, considering what a shrewd woman she was in every other way. What about bitterness's share of the money? Pride? I suppose she couldn't use her husband's savings for those extensions and alterations. I understand that he gave up all claim to the money made in the business, answered her husband in a low voice. He said he wouldn't touch a penny of it, that it was money made by destroying men. So I imagine murmuring had it all. It's complete ruin for them, said Superiority commiseratingly, but with the easy superficial concern felt by those who have an assured fortune and cannot be faced by loss or ruin themselves. Her husband looked at her queerly. His face was very pale and his hands were shaking. After a moment's pause, all he said was, "What a good thing it is that bitterness had already entered the shepherd's service. They will have a roof over their heads anyhow, and somehow, and something to live on. The shepherd appears to provide for his helpers generously when they are in need. It's a pity Murmuring didn't agree with her husband and give up the business when he did, and so escape this complete loss." Giving a harsh, strange laugh, he added, "In the end, fate and good fortune always seem to be on the side of the shepherd's followers, and bad luck with his enemies." His wife looked at him in astonishment. Never had she heard him speak in such a tone of voice or mention the shepherd in that way. Before she could uh, say anything, the maid entered the room carrying the morning paper, which had just arrived, and with an odd, scared look on her face, she laid it beside her master's plate and left the room. Pride unfolded the paper. Huge black headlines stretched right across the front page. Then Superiority saw her husband turn ashy white. The paper fell from nerveless his his nerveless hands, and he slumped forward over the table. She uttered a little cry of terror, rang the bell for help, and hurried to her husband's side. The paper had fallen to the floor, but she caught sight of the headlines. "Greatest fraud of the century, Dead Valley Mines a gigantic hoax, complete collapse of all banks in the city of destruction, all investments a dead loss." As her terrified eyes read these words, the self-assured heiress who had felt herself inaccessible to the blows of fate knew that ruin as complete as that which Murmuring had met during the night had overtaken them also. Only too well she knew that every penny which she and her husband and his parents possessed came from investments in this same gigantic hoax. Everything they possessed was gone from them like a burst bubble. When Pride recovered consciousness, he was in a fearful state of mental fear and distress. For weeks he had been dreading this calamity that had now overtaken them, hoping against hope that the rumors of which resentment had brought word would prove untrue. Now the blow had fallen, everything they possessed was gone, and he knew of no way in which he could earn a living to support his wife and family and his equally penniless parents. He had never learned to work. He knew no